The story of France begins long before it became a recognizable kingdom, and even longer before it rose to the status of a European power. Its earliest roots lie in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and in the migration of Germanic peoples across its former provinces. Among these groups, the Franks would shape the land's future more than any other. Their gradual rise and the political structures they built formed the foundations of what would one day become the French state and, eventually, the French Empire. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was weakening under pressure from both internal decline and repeated invasions. Roman authority in Gaul, the region that would become France, was fragmenting. Legions were understaffed, taxes were difficult to collect, and local leaders increasingly acted on their own. Into this vacuum stepped the Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes who had lived along the Rhine frontier. They did not invade Gaul all at once. Instead, they moved gradually, often serving as Roman allies or federati before becoming independent rulers in their own right. The most influential of the early Frankish leaders was Clovis, the first king to unite many of the Frankish tribes under a single ruler. He came to power in the late 5th century and quickly realized that strength depended on unity, legitimacy, and careful alliances. Clovis is remembered not only for expanding Frankish territory, but also for his strategic conversion to Christianity. According to tradition, he adopted the Catholic faith after a key victory over the Alemanni. His baptism, performed in the city of Reims, aligned him with the Roman Church at a time when most other Germanic rulers followed different branches of Christianity. As the bishop Remigius is said to have told him during the ceremony, he now had to burn what you adored and adore what you burned. This moment helped secure him the support of the powerful Gallo-Roman elite, who preferred a Catholic king to an Arian one. Clovis's success created a political foundation that his successors, the Merovingian dynasty, inherited. Under the Merovingians, the kingdom grew, but it also became increasingly unstable. Power was often divided among sons, leading to rivalries and civil wars. Palace officials, called mayors of the palace, gained influence as kings grew weaker. By the early 8th century, the real authority rested with one of these officials, Charles Martel. His military skill, especially his victory at the Battle of Tours in the early 8th century, strengthened Frankish prestige. Although later storytellers exaggerated the event, portraying it as a decisive clash between Christianity and Islam, the victory still had significant symbolic value. It showed that the Franks were capable of defending their lands and maintaining stability in an uncertain time. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, went a step further. He asked the Pope for recognition to claim the kingship directly, replacing the weakened Merovingian line. When the Pope agreed, Pepin became the first of the Carolingian kings. This alliance between the Franks and the papacy deepened the sense that Frankish rule carried divine approval, a theme that would continue throughout French history. Pepin's campaigns strengthened the kingdom, but it was his son who achieved truly imperial ambitions. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, stands as one of the most important rulers in medieval European history. During his reign in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, he expanded Frankish rule across much of Western and Central Europe. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube and from the North Sea to Italy. Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He reformed administration, encouraged learning, and supported the revival of classical knowledge in monasteries and schools. His court at Aachen became a center of intellectual energy. In the year he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III, he revived a title that had disappeared in the West for centuries. This coronation was deeply symbolic. It suggested that the old Roman world could be reborn under Frankish leadership, and that kingship was tied not just to military power, but also to Christian order. Yet even Charlemagne's vast authority could not prevent the challenges that followed his death. His empire was divided among his heirs, as Germanic tradition required. This division weakened central authority and encouraged local power holders to assert independence. The empire fractured into smaller kingdoms, and over time, the western portion became increasingly distinct. Out of this Western land, shaped by Frankish traditions, Roman influence, and Christian identity, the early Kingdom of France would emerge in the 10th century as Europe experienced renewed waves of instability, including Viking incursions. Noble families gained significant autonomy. Kings struggled to assert control over powerful local lords. It was during this period that Hugh Capet became king. His election in the late 10th century marked the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, which would rule France for centuries. Hugh Capet did not control a large kingdom at first. His direct domain centered around Paris and the surrounding regions. But his dynasty survived because of careful alliances, consistent succession, and the slow but deliberate expansion of royal authority. The Capetian kings built power not through sudden conquest, but through methodical statecraft. They arranged marriages that brought new lands into the royal domain, established clearer lines of inheritance, and strengthened ties with the church. Their reign also coincided with the gradual growth of towns, trade, and agricultural productivity, all of which gave the monarchy more resources. By the reign of Philip II, often known as Philip Augustus, in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the French crown had achieved much firmer control over its nobles and had begun expanding into territories previously dominated by the English kings. Throughout these centuries, the idea of France as a unified kingdom slowly took shape. It was not yet the centralized state that would later build a global empire, but the foundations were there: a monarchy seeking legitimacy, a church offering spiritual authority, and a cultural identity formed by Latin Christianity, feudal bonds, and shared traditions. The rulers of France were learning to balance alliances, war, administration, and the demands of a diverse population. Another essential factor was the evolving relationship between kings and the church. From Clovis to Charlemagne to the Capetians, French rulers benefited from religious support, which strengthened their claims and helped them govern a land made up of many local powers. Bishops served as administrators, monasteries preserved knowledge, and church ceremonies reinforced the sense of a sacred monarchy. France became, in many ways, the heartland of medieval Western Christianity, a reputation that would influence its culture far beyond the Middle Ages. By the early 13th century, the Kingdom of France was entering a new stage in its development. The long process of unification that had begun under the early Capetian kings was now giving way to something more ambitious: the creation of a centralized state capable of enforcing royal authority across diverse regions, challenging rival powers, and shaping the direction of European politics. This period would see the French monarchy grow in strength, develop new institutions, and confront challenges that pushed it toward a clearer sense of national identity and long-term strategy. At the heart of this transformation stood rulers like Philip II, often called Philip Augustus, who expanded the power of the French crown with a combination of military campaigns, administrative reforms, and political skill. Earlier kings had worked to strengthen their direct lands, but Philip II went further. He seized opportunities to weaken the powerful English monarchy, which still held large territories in France. Through calculated wars and diplomatic pressure, he managed to take regions such as Normandy, Anjou, and Touraine from the English king, greatly enlarging the royal domain. These gains not only increased French territory, but also reduced the influence of nobles who might have challenged the crown. Philip's success demonstrated an important shift in the nature of French kingship. The monarchy was no longer a symbolic institution surrounded by powerful regional lords. It was becoming the commanding force in a structure where the king's word carried weight across the land. To support this new level of control, Philip invested in administration. He began using written records more systematically, a practice that helped the monarchy govern more effectively. Royal officials known as bailis and seneschaux were appointed to oversee justice, collect revenues, and enforce royal policies. Their presence strengthened the king's ability to manage distant regions and ensured that local nobles had less space to act independently. This increased centralization had significant social consequences. As towns grew and trade expanded, urban communities often sought the king's protection against local lords. By granting charters and privileges to these towns, French kings gained valuable allies in their efforts to limit noble power. In return, towns supported the monarchy with taxes, manpower, and economic activity. This partnership between crown and urban society would shape French politics for centuries. Another major figure of this era was Louis IX, remembered today as St. Louis. His reign combined strong governance with deep personal piety, and his influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Louis IX worked tirelessly to improve justice within the kingdom. He believed that a king should rule with fairness, and he regularly heard legal cases in person. His efforts helped establish the idea that the crown was the ultimate source of justice in the realm. Royal courts expanded their authority, and appeals increasingly flowed toward the monarchy instead of local feudal courts. Under Louis IX, the French administration grew more professional. Written laws and regulations multiplied, and officials were expected to follow clearer procedures. These developments helped shape a more predictable and stable government. Louis also strengthened the monarchy's relationship with the church. Although he supported the church, he also defended the rights of the crown, insisting that royal authority should not be overshadowed by religious influence. His balanced approach contributed to a lasting structure in which monarchy and church worked together but maintained distinct roles. During this period, France also engaged in wider European politics. Neighboring kingdoms such as England and the Holy Roman Empire posed significant challenges. The rivalry with England in particular shaped the political landscape. English kings who ruled territories on the continent were technically vassals of the French crown, but in practice they acted as independent rulers. This imbalance led to repeated tensions and set the foundation for later conflicts. France's growing power under Philip II and Louis IX shifted the balance of this relationship, reducing English influence and strengthening French sovereignty. At the same time, France participated in the broader religious and military movements of the era, including the Crusades. Louis IX led two major crusading expeditions in the eastern Mediterranean. Although these campaigns did not achieve lasting military success, they reinforced France's role in Christian Europe and deepened the king's reputation for devotion. The Crusades also increased contact between France and the wider world, influencing trade, culture, and intellectual exchange. As royal power expanded, the monarchy faced new internal challenges. Nobles who had once acted autonomously found themselves constrained by stronger central authority. Some resisted, forming alliances or taking up arms, yet the kings of France responded with diplomacy or military force, gradually reinforcing their dominance. One important example was the suppression of powerful aristocratic families who attempted to regain autonomy. Royal armies, supported by improved taxation and administrative organization, usually prevailed. Each victory further discouraged noble resistance and helped integrate the kingdom more tightly. Another major turning point in this era was the conflict between the French crown and the papacy during the reign of Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. This struggle reflected the changing relationship between church and monarchy. While earlier kings had relied heavily on the church for legitimacy, by this time the monarchy was strong enough to challenge papal authority directly. Philip IV sought to tax the clergy and assert broader control over the church within France. His dispute with Pope Boniface VIII escalated dramatically, eventually leading to the relocation of the papal court to the city of Avignon under French influence. This period, sometimes called the Avignon Papacy, strengthened the French monarchy's role in European affairs and highlighted the growing independence of secular rulers. Economic changes also contributed to France's development. Improved agricultural methods increased productivity, while expanding trade networks connected France to markets in the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, and beyond. As commerce grew, so did the need for stable currency, reliable laws, and consistent administration. The crown met these demands by standardizing coinage and expanding fiscal institutions. Taxes and feudal dues provided revenue to support military campaigns, build infrastructure, and finance royal projects. These systems laid early groundwork for the future state bureaucracy that would define later French power. Cultural developments during this period helped shape a distinct French identity. The French language evolved, gradually replacing Latin in official documents, and literature universities, such as the one in Paris, attracted students and scholars from across Europe. French art, architecture, and learning gained international recognition, particularly through the spread of Gothic architecture. Cathedrals like those in Paris, Chartres, and Amiens symbolized both religious devotion and royal prestige. Despite these advances, France was not yet a fully unified or stable nation. Regional differences remained significant, especially in areas recently brought under royal control. Local customs, laws, and languages varied widely. The crown had to balance the desire for central authority with the practical need to respect local traditions. This balance often required careful negotiation with regional nobles, bishops, and town leaders. The monarchy succeeded largely because it adapted to circumstances rather than imposing uniformity all at once. One important consequence of this era was the emergence of a more modern style of warfare. As armies grew larger and more professional, the French crown needed new ways to fund and organize its forces. Feudal levies were no longer sufficient for long campaigns. Instead, kings relied increasingly on paid soldiers and mercenaries. This shift required substantial financial resources, further encouraging improved taxation and administration. Military needs also inspired innovations in logistics, fortification, and strategy, strengthening the kingdom's capacity to project power. By the early 14th century, France had grown into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Its monarchy was stronger, its administration more organized, and its cultural influence broader than ever before. Yet beneath this surface of strength lay unresolved tensions, especially with England, whose kings still held territories on the European continent. These tensions, combined with dynastic disputes and shifting alliances, would lead to one of the longest and most transformative conflicts in medieval history: the 100 Years' War. This struggle did not last one continuous century, but it unfolded through a long series of campaigns, truces, and renewed battles. It reshaped the identity of France, tested the legitimacy of its rulers, and brought forth one of history's most symbolic figures, Joan of Arc. The origins of the conflict lay in the intertwined royal families of France and England. Through years of marriages and inheritances, the kings of England had come to hold lands in France as vassals of the French crown. This arrangement created constant tension. No king was comfortable being both an independent ruler and a vassal to another monarch. When the French king Charles IV died without a direct male heir, the issue of succession brought the rivalry to a breaking point. Edward III, King of England and grandson of a French king through his mother, put forward a claim to the French throne. The French nobility, however, chose Philip VI, a member of a different branch of the royal family. France did not recognize inheritance through the female line, and Philip's supporters insisted that the crown could not pass through a woman. This disagreement could have remained a political debate, but deeper issues made war almost inevitable. English kings feared losing their territories in France. French kings wanted to end English influence within their borders. Trade disputes between the two kingdoms added further tension, especially over the wealthy region of Flanders, where English wool supported a thriving cloth industry. These combined pressures set the stage for a conflict far larger than a simple question of succession. Early in the war, English forces achieved several dramatic victories. Their success came in part from their military tactics. English armies relied heavily on longbowmen, who could unleash rapid volleys of arrows that disrupted enemy formations. French knights, still following older traditions of heavy cavalry charges, often found themselves unprepared for this new style of warfare. Battles such as Crécy and Poitiers demonstrated the effectiveness of English tactics. In one of these early engagements, the French king John II was even captured, a humiliation that weakened French morale and strained the kingdom's finances. These defeats exposed deep divisions within France. Many nobles were reluctant to cooperate fully with the crown. Regional loyalties often mattered more than national unity. In some areas, local lords negotiated with the English for their own benefit, prioritizing their private interests over the kingdom's stability. The monarchy struggled to coordinate the war effort across a diverse and sometimes rebellious landscape. Adding to these challenges, France faced devastating crises that went beyond the battlefield. The spread of the plague, known as the Black Death, caused massive population loss across Europe. In France, entire villages were emptied, farmland was abandoned, and social structures were strained. Economic hardship followed, making it even harder for the monarchy to raise funds for the war. These hardships created unrest among peasants, some of whom rose in violent uprisings. One of the most notable rebellions, known as the Jacquerie, erupted as peasants vented their frustration against noble landlords and the general chaos of the time. Although the uprising was crushed, it showed how fragile the kingdom had become. Meanwhile, English successes continued. For a time, they gained control over large parts of northern France, including key territories like Normandy. The English King Henry V later launched a renewed campaign during a period of French weakness caused by internal conflicts within the French royal family. The French court was divided between two rival factions, supporters of the Armagnacs and supporters of the Burgundians. These groups competed for influence and occasionally fought one another, giving the English an advantage. Henry V captured the imagination of his supporters with his victory at the Battle of Agincourt, where a smaller English force defeated a much larger French army. After this victory, he negotiated the Treaty of Troyes, in which the French king Charles VI recognized Henry as his heir and agreed that the crown of France would pass to the English monarchy. Many French nobles accepted this arrangement, especially those aligned with the Burgundians, who had become hostile to the rival Armagnac faction. It seemed for a moment that France might fall under English rule completely. Yet, the French monarchy still had supporters who refused to accept English dominance. One of these was Charles, the son of the French king, who contested the treaty and claimed the title of Dauphin, or heir to the throne. However, Charles faced enormous obstacles. Much of northern France was under English control, and many citizens doubted his ability to lead. His court, based in the southern region of the Loire Valley, lacked resources and legitimacy. France had reached a low point, divided, weakened, and uncertain of its future. It was in this bleak moment that Joan of Arc appeared, a young woman from the village of Domremy in northeastern France. She claimed to have received visions urging her to support the Dauphin and help lift the English siege of the city of Orléans. Her arrival at Charles's court was unexpected, and many doubted her story, yet Charles eventually agreed to give her a chance, partly because he had little left to lose. Joan's presence brought a surge of hope and determination to the French forces. She encouraged soldiers, inspired the population, and gave the Dauphin's followers renewed confidence. Her role in lifting the siege of Orléans became a turning point in the war. Although she was not a battlefield commander in the modern sense, her influence on morale and strategy was undeniable. French forces became more organized and more daring, and Joan's determination helped unite factions that had previously struggled to cooperate. After the victory at Orléans, Joan urged Charles to travel to Reims for his coronation. The symbolism of this location was crucial. French kings had traditionally been crowned at Reims, and performing the ceremony there would reinforce Charles's legitimacy. Despite the risks involved in crossing territory contested by the English and their allies, Charles agreed. When he was crowned as Charles VII, the event marked a powerful statement that the French monarchy would endure. Joan's success, however, also brought her enemies. She challenged traditional assumptions about gender, authority, and religious influence. Some nobles feared her growing popularity, and the English saw her as a threat to their claim on the throne. Eventually, she was captured by Burgundian forces, who handed her over to the English. Joan was put on trial in the city of Rouen, accused of heresy and witchcraft. The trial was political, aimed at undermining her influence and discrediting the French king she had supported. She was condemned and burned at the stake, an event that shocked many and turned her into a martyr in the eyes of her supporters. Her death did not stop the momentum she had helped create. Over the following decades, French forces strengthened their position, regained territory, and pushed the English out of most of France. Military reforms, improved leadership, and the gradual unification of the kingdom all contributed to the French recovery. The war, once dominated by English advances, turned into a series of French victories. By the time the conflict drew to a close in the mid-15th century, the English held only the city of Calais on the continent. When the long turmoil of the Hundred Years' War finally eased, France entered a new era filled with opportunity, creativity, and serious internal challenges. The 15th and 16th centuries saw the kingdom transform culturally, politically, and intellectually. This was the age of the Renaissance in France, a period that introduced new ideas about art, science, and human potential. It was also a time of growing rivalry with powerful European neighbors and deepening tensions within the kingdom itself, leading to prolonged conflict known as the Wars of Religion. These developments would shape the monarchy, influence French ambitions overseas, and lay the groundwork for France's future role as a major European power. As peace settled over the kingdom, the French monarchy worked to rebuild lost strength. Under kings such as Charles VII and Louis XI, the crown began consolidating authority. They reorganized the army and improved taxation, creating the framework for a more stable state. Towns and trade revived, noble factions weakened, and the idea of a strong central government gained momentum. But the true transformation of French culture and politics appeared during the reign of Francis I, a king whose rule marked the arrival of the Renaissance spirit. Francis I came to the throne in the early 16th century and quickly embraced the artistic and intellectual movements spreading from Italy. He invited Italian artists, architects, and scholars to his court, establishing France as a major center of Renaissance culture. The most famous of these guests was Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his final years in France and brought with him a wealth of knowledge and artistic innovation under Francis I. Royal chateaux expanded across the Loire Valley. Elegant structures like Chambord and Fontainebleau reflected not only the king's taste but also the broader shift toward a more refined and outward-looking culture. The Renaissance was more than a display of art. It introduced new thinking about politics, science, and the role of the individual. Humanist scholars promoted the study of classical texts, encouraging a deeper interest in education and critical inquiry. The printing press, which spread rapidly during this era, allowed books to circulate more widely than ever before. This expanded access to knowledge helped shape an emerging class of educated citizens and encouraged debate about the nature of power, faith, and society. While the Renaissance enriched French culture, it also exposed the kingdom to new political pressures. Francis I's reign coincided with the rise of the Habsburg dynasty, which controlled a vast empire that included Spain, parts of Italy, and territories in Central Europe and the Americas. The rivalry between Francis I and the Habsburg ruler Charles V became one of the defining struggles of the era. The two men competed for influence in Italy, fought several wars, and attempted to assert dominance over European politics. Although neither gained absolute victory, their rivalry shaped the balance of power across the continent. These military conflicts strained France's finances and highlighted the need for new sources of wealth and trade. Spanish and Portuguese explorers were already establishing routes to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, giving their kingdoms access to new goods and resources. France, not wanting to be left behind, began attempting its own voyages across the Atlantic. Explorers such as Jacques Cartier journeyed to the lands that would later become Canada, sailing along the St. Lawrence River and establishing early French claims in North America. These efforts did not immediately produce large settlements or riches, but they marked the beginning of French overseas ambition. Back at home, however, a much more dangerous challenge was emerging. The Protestant Reformation spread across Europe, challenging the Catholic Church's authority and offering alternative forms of Christian worship. In France, this movement attracted followers among both common citizens and influential nobles. These French Protestants, known as Huguenots, began forming communities throughout the kingdom. Their growing presence alarmed both the monarchy and the Catholic majority, who feared that religious division would threaten national unity. Attempts by the monarchy to address the issue were hesitant and inconsistent. Some kings tried to suppress Protestant worship, while others sought compromise. Tensions escalated as influential noble families took sides. The powerful Bourbon family aligned with the Huguenots, while the equally influential Guise family championed Catholic interests. These rivalries pushed France toward a series of violent conflicts that would last for decades. The wars of religion began in the mid-16th century and were marked by shifting alliances, assassinations, and brutal massacres. One of the most infamous episodes was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when thousands of Huguenots were killed in Paris and other cities. This violence deepened mistrust between communities and prolonged the conflict. Ordinary citizens suffered as armies moved through towns, crops were destroyed, and trade collapsed. The monarchy, trapped between factions, found it increasingly difficult to govern effectively. During this crisis, one figure emerged who would eventually bring stability back to the kingdom. Henry IV, born a Protestant and a member of the Bourbon family, he inherited a claim to the French throne during the final stages of the conflict. But many Catholic leaders refused to support a Protestant king. Henry understood that to rule a fractured kingdom, he would need to rise above the religious divide. He made a momentous decision to convert to Catholicism, reportedly declaring that Paris is well worth a mass. Whether he said these exact words is debated, but the sentiment reflects his pragmatic approach to leadership. Once on the throne, Henry IV sought to end the cycle of war and distrust. He issued the Edict of Nantes, a landmark agreement that granted limited freedom of worship to Protestants while maintaining Catholicism as the official religion of France. This compromise did not create complete harmony, but it did offer a foundation for peace. By recognizing the rights of Huguenots while reinforcing royal control, Henry IV restored a measure of stability that the kingdom had desperately needed. Henry's reign also marked a return to stronger monarchy. He worked to rebuild the economy, repair damaged towns, and improve agriculture. His minister, the skilled administrator Sully, introduced reforms that reduced corruption, encouraged trade, and supported infrastructure. These reforms strengthened the foundations of the state and helped restore public trust after years of chaos. The settlement of the religious wars did more than end violence. It revealed the importance of a monarchy capable of navigating complex political and social pressures. It also highlighted the limits of absolute authority. A king could no longer rely solely on tradition or divine right. He needed to manage competing interests and adapt to changing circumstances. This reality would shape the future of French governance. Meanwhile, international competition continued to push France toward greater involvement overseas. Although early attempts to build colonies had been limited, French merchants and explorers remained active. The Caribbean, with its possibilities for sugar cultivation, began attracting interest. West Africa offered opportunities for trade, and the North American interior remained a region of curiosity and potential. These early efforts were still small in scale, but they signaled a growing willingness to look beyond Europe for wealth and influence. The Renaissance era also strengthened the cultural identity of France. The French language became more standardized and increasingly used in official documents. Writers, poets, and thinkers enriched French literature. Scientists and mathematicians explored new ideas, contributing to the broader intellectual currents sweeping Europe. Artistic styles evolved, blending Italian influences with French traditions. This cultural flowering helped shape a sense of national pride. As France entered the 17th century, it stood at the threshold of a major transformation. The kingdom had survived religious conflict, rebuilt its institutions, and begun to articulate broader ambitions on the world stage. But the next phase of French history would be defined by something new: the rise of royal absolutism, a system in which the king claimed unprecedented power over the state and society. Under the Bourbon dynasty, France would strengthen its government, reshape its economy, and begin constructing a colonial empire that reached across continents. These developments set the stage for France's emergence as one of the leading powers of early modern Europe. The foundations of absolutism were laid during the reign of Louis XIII. Although he had taken the throne as a child, real authority initially lay in the hands of his mother, Marie de Medici, who served as regent. Political instability marked these early years, with noble factions competing for influence and regional leaders resisting central control. But when Louis XIII reached adulthood, he began asserting his authority, especially after forming a key partnership with his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu played a defining role in shaping the direction of the French state. He believed that the monarchy had to be strong if the kingdom was to remain stable and powerful. To achieve this, he sought to reduce the influence of the nobility, strengthen the authority of the crown, and centralize administration. One of his strategies was to appoint royal officials known as intendants, who were sent across the kingdom to carry out royal orders, collect taxes, and report directly to the central government. These officials bypassed local noble power and made the administration more efficient. Richelieu also confronted groups that he believed threatened the unity of France. The Huguenots, though protected by earlier agreements, maintained fortified towns and independent political structures. Richelieu viewed this as a challenge to royal control. His campaign against the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle marked a decisive moment. After a prolonged siege, the city fell, and Huguenots lost many of their political privileges, although they retained freedom of worship. With this victory, the crown made it clear that no group within France could maintain separate political authority. Richelieu also played an important role in foreign policy. He understood that France needed to counterbalance the power of the Habsburg dynasty, which controlled Spain and large parts of Central Europe. Although France was a Catholic nation, Richelieu did not hesitate to support Protestant states during the 30 Years' War when it served French interests. His overarching goal was to ensure that the Habsburgs did not dominate Europe. This willingness to prioritize national strategy over religious identity showed a level of statecraft that would become central to French diplomacy. When Richelieu died, his influence continued through his successor, Cardinal Mazarin, who advised the young Louis XIV. Mazarin faced immediate challenges, including a series of rebellions known as the Fronde. These uprisings were led by nobles, magistrates, and even some common citizens who opposed certain royal policies, especially taxation and centralized authority. The Fronde revealed widespread concern about the growing power of the monarchy. It also marked a moment of deep insecurity for the young king, but the failure of the rebellions ultimately strengthened the crown. Louis XIV, who witnessed firsthand the dangers of unrest, resolved to ensure that royal authority would never again be undermined. When he assumed full personal control of the government after Mazarin's death, he brought French absolutism to its peak. Louis XIV, often called the Sun King, believed that the monarchy must stand at the center of the state. He famously declared, "I am the state," a phrase that captured his vision of absolute royal authority. He built the magnificent Palace of Versailles, not only as a residence but as a political tool. By requiring nobles to live at court for part of the year, he limited their ability to build independent bases of power in their own regions. Life at Versailles revolved around elaborate ceremonies that highlighted the king's prestige. Nobles competed for the honor of performing small tasks during these rituals, reinforcing their dependence on royal favor. While Louis XIV was cultivating grandeur at home, he was also overseeing major changes to the administration and economy. His finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, introduced reforms designed to make France economically strong. Colbert promoted manufacturing, improved infrastructure, and encouraged trade. He also believed that a strong merchant fleet and overseas colonies were essential for national power. Under Colbert's guidance, France expanded its involvement in global commerce and strengthened the structures needed to support a growing empire. French colonial ambitions took shape during this era in several regions. In North America, the vast territory known as New France began to develop. French explorers, traders, and missionaries traveled deep into the interior, reaching the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley. They forged alliances with indigenous nations, participated in the fur trade, and established settlements in areas that would become Canada and parts of the United States. Although these colonies did not match the population levels of English settlements, they played a key role in France's North American strategy. In the Caribbean, France established colonies on islands such as Martinique and Saint-Domingue. These territories became major producers of sugar, a valuable commodity in European markets. Plantation economies depended heavily on enslaved African labor, and the transatlantic slave trade grew as the demand for sugar increased. French colonial policy in these regions focused on maximizing economic returns, and the harsh realities of slavery played a central role in sustaining these plantations. In West Africa, French traders established coastal posts that served as centers for trade, including the exchange of goods and the trafficking of enslaved people. Along the Indian Ocean, France also sought influence in territories such as Madagascar and parts of India, where the French East India Company attempted to establish commercial strongholds. These early colonial efforts reflected France's growing desire to compete with other European powers, particularly England and the Netherlands. Control over trade routes, resources, and strategic territories became essential goals of foreign policy. French colonial administrators, merchants, and missionaries all contributed to this expanding global presence. At the same time, France continued to pursue ambitious goals in Europe. Louis XIV fought several major wars aimed at expanding French territory and influence. Some campaigns brought temporary gains, such as the acquisition of regions along the borders of the kingdom. But prolonged military effort placed significant strain on the economy and population. The War of the Spanish Succession consumed enormous resources and ultimately limited French expansion. Although Louis managed to place a Bourbon relative on the Spanish throne, the war prevented France and Spain from forming a unified empire. Despite these challenges, Louis XIV succeeded in creating a powerful centralized state. The administration was more structured, taxation more regular, and royal authority more secure than ever before. The monarchy's ability to project power, both within France and overseas, marked a significant evolution in the kingdom's development. Culture also thrived during this period. French literature, art, and architecture attained new heights. Writers such as Molière, Racine, and La Fontaine produced works that helped define French classical culture. The Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Painting and Sculpture supported intellectual and artistic achievements. French language and culture began to spread across Europe, influencing courts and scholars alike. By the dawn of the 18th century, France stood as a powerful kingdom with extensive political influence, a flourishing cultural life, and a growing overseas empire. The absolutist system shaped under Louis XIV remained strong, yet beneath the surface, pressures were building that would slowly weaken the old order. New ideas, economic challenges, social inequalities, and shifting global dynamics all contributed to a period of profound transformation. This era, stretching from the early 1800s to the outbreak of the French Revolution, marked a pivotal stage in France's history, one that prepared the ground for dramatic change. After the death of Louis XIV, the kingdom passed to his great-grandson, Louis XV, who inherited a state fatigued by decades of costly warfare. The young king's reign began under the guidance of the Duke of Orleans, who acted as regent. During these early years, France experimented with a more flexible political atmosphere. Restrictions on debate loosened and intellectual curiosity expanded. But despite a momentary sense of openness, the monarchy still clung to the fundamental structures of absolutism. Louis XV eventually ruled in his own name, but his approach to governance differed from that of his predecessor. He was less inclined to dominate political life personally and more willing to rely on ministers and advisors. Although France enjoyed periods of peace and prosperity, underlying weaknesses in the state became increasingly visible. Administratively, the kingdom struggled with a patchwork of overlapping privileges, local laws, and exemptions that made tax collection inefficient. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy towns retained special rights, placing a heavy burden on peasants and commoners. Efforts to reform this system repeatedly met resistance, especially from influential aristocrats who defended their traditional privileges. At the same time, the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment began reshaping European thought. Philosophers, writers, and scientists challenged long-held assumptions about authority, religion, and society. Figures such as Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau argued for ideas like separation of powers, religious tolerance, individual rights, and a government that derived legitimacy from the people rather than divine right. These writers did not agree on every issue, but collectively, their works questioned the foundations of the old regime. Montesquieu examined political systems across history and proposed that liberty depended on balancing governmental powers. Voltaire used wit and sharp criticism to expose injustice, censorship, and superstition. Rousseau emphasized the importance of human freedom and the corrupting influence of inequality, famously asserting that true political authority must come from a social contract rooted in the general will. These ideas circulated widely in France thanks to the spread of printed materials. Salons hosted by educated women, bustling coffee houses, and clandestine printing presses created a vibrant network through which new ideas reached people across different social levels. Alongside this intellectual awakening, France continued to participate in global competition, particularly against Britain. The rivalry expanded beyond Europe into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, where each power sought to control trade routes, secure resources, and establish dominance. The 7 Years' War, fought on multiple continents, became a critical moment. France entered the conflict hoping to protect its colonial possessions, especially in North America, where New France had developed into a sprawling territory stretching from Canada to the Mississippi Valley. Yet the war proved disastrous for France. British forces captured major French strongholds, and the eventual peace negotiations forced France to surrender most of its North American territories. The loss of these lands was a heavy blow to national pride and severely weakened France's position in global politics. Many observers saw the defeat as evidence of mismanagement, corruption, and outdated military strategy. As criticism grew, confidence in the monarchy declined further. Despite this setback, France's overseas ambitions did not disappear. In the Caribbean, colonies such as Saint-Domingue continued to generate enormous wealth through sugar production, fueled by the labor of enslaved Africans. These islands became some of the most profitable territories in the world, but they also exposed deep contradictions in French society. While Enlightenment thinkers argued for human dignity and natural rights, the colonial economy depended on a system of extreme exploitation and racial hierarchy. Meanwhile, France sought to expand its influence in Africa and Asia. Trading posts along the West African coast facilitated the exchange of goods and the trafficking of enslaved people. In India, the French East India Company competed with the British for control over strategic ports and alliances with local rulers. Although France achieved some temporary victories, it ultimately struggled to match British strength in the region, especially after the setbacks of the 7 Years' War. These global conflicts put increasing strain on the French economy. War was expensive, and maintaining overseas colonies required ships, soldiers, administrators, and continuous investment. The monarchy accumulated substantial debt, and attempts to raise revenue faced fierce resistance from privileged groups who refused to surrender their exemptions. Ministers like Turgot and Necker sought to introduce reforms that would modernize the financial system, reduce waste, and broaden the tax base. But each effort encountered opposition from nobles, clergy, or regional parliaments, law courts that claimed the right to register or reject royal edicts. As financial pressures intensified, France made a bold decision to support the American colonies in their struggle for independence from Britain. The motivation was strategic as well as ideological. Striking at Britain offered a chance to restore French prestige and weaken a powerful rival. French officers and soldiers, including the young Marquis de Lafayette, crossed the Atlantic to assist the American cause. The war proved costly, but it ended with victory for the Americans and a sense of renewed confidence for France. The American Revolution also had a profound intellectual impact on France. Many French observers were inspired by the creation of a republic grounded in Enlightenment principles. The success of the American cause demonstrated that a political system based on popular sovereignty could challenge and defeat an established monarchy. These ideas resonated strongly in France at a time when dissatisfaction with the old regime was growing. Meanwhile, economic hardship deepened social tensions within the kingdom. Bad harvests, rising prices, and unemployment fueled unrest among peasants and urban workers. The tax burden remained uneven, and resentment toward privileged estates increased. Although the French population was diverse, ranging from wealthy merchants to struggling farmers, the majority shared a common frustration. They felt the system was unfair and stagnant. Culturally, France continued to thrive. Paris served as a brilliant center of art, science, and intellectual debate. But the very success of French culture contributed to rising expectations. People became more aware of inequalities and more critical of authority. The growth of reading, the spread of pamphlets, and the lively press fostered a more informed and politically engaged public. In the meantime, religious tensions also persisted. The Catholic Church held significant wealth and influence, but it faced criticism for its privileged position and its resistance to reform. Many Enlightenment thinkers called for greater religious tolerance, while others questioned the Church's role in public life altogether. These debates further eroded the traditional balance between monarchy, church, and society. As the 18th century moved toward its turbulent close, France found itself burdened by problems too large for the old regime to contain: financial crises, demands for reform, the influence of Enlightenment ideas, and the rising expectations of a more politically aware public were converging to create a moment of immense transformation. What followed was not simply a change in leadership or law, but a fundamental reimagining of what France could be. The French Revolution reshaped the kingdom's identity, redrew its political structures, and introduced new principles that would echo far beyond its borders. The immediate trigger for the revolution was financial collapse. France's participation in global conflicts, especially its support for the American Revolution, had left the treasury strained and the government deeply in debt. Ministers proposed reforms that included taxing previously exempt groups such as the clergy and nobility, but these proposals were repeatedly blocked. Those who benefited from the old system resisted any change that might weaken their privileges. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens faced rising bread prices, poor harvests, and widespread unemployment. Public anger grew steadily as hardship deepened. In this environment of crisis, King Louis XVI made a decision that would prove pivotal. He called for a meeting of the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not convened for many generations. The kingdom's population was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. While the first two estates enjoyed significant privileges, the third estate represented the vast majority of the population yet had the least political power. Many saw the meeting as an opportunity to address long-standing grievances. But the old voting system, where each estate had a single collective vote, meant the privileged groups could easily override the will of the commoners. Frustration boiled over quickly. Delegates of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming the right to speak for the nation as a whole. When they found themselves locked out of their regular meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath. They would not disband until they had created a new constitution. This act marked the beginning of a direct challenge to absolute monarchy. Public anger erupted into open revolt. In Paris, rumors spread that the king was preparing to use force against the assembly. Crowds stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal authority. Although the number of prisoners held there was small, the fall of the Bastille carried immense symbolic weight. It demonstrated that the king could no longer rely on fear to control the population. Revolutionary enthusiasm spread to the countryside, where peasants rose up against local landlords in what became known as the Great Fear. Facing widespread unrest, the assembly moved to abolish feudal privileges, ending centuries-old rights that had allowed nobles to extract dues and services from peasants. In the months that followed, the National Assembly drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document inspired by Enlightenment ideals. It asserted that all men were born free and equal in rights, that sovereignty belonged to the nation, and that the law should apply equally to everyone. This declaration represented a direct break with the old regime's hierarchy and privilege. It articulated a vision of citizenship grounded in universal principles rather than birth or status. The monarchy, however, struggled to adapt to the new political landscape. King Louis XVI resisted many of the Assembly's reforms and attempted to flee the country with his family. His capture during this attempted escape severely damaged his credibility. Many citizens began to see him as an opponent of the revolution, and calls for a republic grew louder. France's situation became even more complicated when foreign powers intervened. Monarchies across Europe watched the revolution with alarm, fearing that its ideas would spread beyond France's borders. Austria and Prussia demanded that the French restore the king's authority. In response, the French revolutionary government declared war, believing that defending the revolution against foreign enemies would strengthen national unity. But early military efforts ended in chaos. Desertions, betrayals, and lack of experience created panic in Paris, fueling suspicion that counter-revolutionary forces were plotting to overthrow the new order. Amid this fear, radical factions gained influence. The Jacobins and their allies argued that internal enemies posed a greater threat than foreign armies. When the monarchy was finally suspended, the National Convention declared France a republic. The king was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and executed by guillotine. His death marked the irreversible end of monarchy in France and intensified the revolution's radical phase. The period that followed, known as the Reign of Terror, was driven by the conviction that the revolution needed to be defended at all costs. The Committee of Public Safety, led by figures like Robespierre, assumed broad powers and targeted anyone suspected of resisting revolutionary change. Thousands were executed or imprisoned in the name of protecting the nation. The terror reflected the deep anxieties of a society undergoing rapid transformation while facing foreign invasion and internal rebellion. While violence dominated public life, the revolution also introduced sweeping reforms. The government reorganized administrative districts, standardized legal codes, and sought to reduce the influence of the church. Many church properties were seized, and new secular rituals replaced traditional religious practices. Revolutionary leaders believed that creating a new society required reshaping not only institutions but also culture and daily life. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of conscription. The levée en masse called citizens to defend the nation collectively, creating armies larger and more motivated than those of the old regime. This expansion of military mobilization allowed France to push back foreign invaders and eventually secure victories across Europe. It also introduced the powerful concept of a citizen army, united not by loyalty to a monarch, but by commitment to the nation. The revolution had profound effects beyond France's borders, especially in the colonies. Revolutionary leaders abolished slavery in French territories, inspired in part by uprisings in the Caribbean. In the colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people rose in a massive revolt, challenging plantation owners and asserting their right to freedom. Revolutionary ideals gave new legitimacy to their struggle, although tensions between French authorities and the island's leaders would continue in the years ahead. Despite the lofty ideals of the revolution, the period remained unstable. Factionalism, economic hardship, and the exhaustion of constant crisis eventually weakened the radical government. When Robespierre himself was arrested and executed, the terror came to an end. A more moderate government called the Directory assumed power, but it struggled to address the country's pressing needs. Corruption, shortages, and ongoing military challenges reduced public confidence in its leadership. Amid these difficulties, one figure began rising to prominence. Napoleon Bonaparte, a talented military officer, gained national attention through his victories in Italy and his bold leadership style. He presented himself as a defender of revolutionary values, yet he also understood the need for stability and order. Many citizens saw him as someone capable of restoring strength to the nation without returning to the old forms of monarchy. Political leaders within the Directory also viewed him as a useful ally or a dangerous rival. Their inability to manage the country effectively created openings for ambitious figures. Eventually, a group of conspirators invited Napoleon to participate in a plan to reorganize the government. The resulting coup transformed the political landscape. Napoleon emerged as the central authority in France, holding the title of First Consul. When the revolution reached its exhausted conclusion and the Directory struggled to maintain control, France stood ready for new leadership, someone capable of restoring order without reversing the core achievements of the past decade. Into this moment stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, a military commander whose ambition, intelligence, and personal charisma would propel him from relatively modest beginnings to the height of imperial power. His rise reshaped France and transformed Europe, ushering in the era of the First French Empire. Napoleon first gained notice during the Revolutionary Wars, where he demonstrated strategic skill and an ability to inspire troops. His victories in the Italian campaigns revealed a commander who understood both battlefield tactics and the political value of military success. He presented himself as a champion of the revolution, yet also as someone capable of imposing discipline on a country weary of instability. While many revolutionary leaders had strong ideals but weak administrative ability, Napoleon displayed a rare combination of vision and practicality. The political environment of France at the time made his ascent possible. The Directory, created to replace the radical government of the revolution, became increasingly unpopular. It faced financial problems, military pressures, and widespread corruption. Public confidence sank as the government lurched from one crisis to another. Within this atmosphere of frustration, Napoleon and several political allies staged a coup that replaced the Directory with a new system known as the Consulate. Under this arrangement, Napoleon assumed the title of First Consul, granting him broad control over the state. Although he claimed that his leadership was grounded in republican principles, Napoleon steadily concentrated power. He reformed the government, reorganized institutions, and placed loyal administrators in key positions. His approach emphasized efficiency and stability. One of his most lasting contributions was the creation of the Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code. This legal framework simplified and standardized laws across France, replacing the patchwork of regional customs that had existed for centuries. The code embodied principles of property rights, equality before the law, and secular governance. Its influence extended far beyond France, shaping legal systems across Europe and even in parts of the world that had never been under French control. Napoleon also restructured education, establishing schools that focused on producing a disciplined and loyal administrative class. He centralized taxation, strengthened the currency, and worked to stabilize the economy after years of inflation and disruption. These reforms gave many citizens a sense that France was finally moving toward order after a long period of upheaval. Outside France, the situation remained unsettled. European monarchies viewed the revolution with suspicion and continued to oppose its spread. They launched coalitions to contain French influence, but Napoleon responded with decisive military campaigns. His victories gained him enormous prestige and allowed France to dominate much of continental Europe. Territories that had once resisted French power were brought under direct control or transformed into satellite states ruled by his relatives or loyal allies. Napoleon's approach combined military might with administrative reform. Wherever French armies advanced, they carried elements of the revolutionary and Napoleonic systems with them, introducing changes that affected law, taxation, and social structures. As his successes grew, Napoleon took a step that signaled the completion of his transformation. He crowned himself Emperor of the French. The ceremony, held in Paris with great ceremony, symbolized both a return to monarchical grandeur and the creation of a new kind of empire. Napoleon's empire did not claim ancestry from ancient dynasties, but presented itself as the product of national will and personal merit. The title Emperor of the French, rather than of France, suggested that his authority came from the people rather than from inherited divine right. Under Napoleon's rule, France engaged in a series of monumental conflicts often referred to as the Napoleonic Wars. These battles involved nearly every major European power and reshaped alliances across the continent. Napoleon's victories at places like Austerlitz and Jena demonstrated the effectiveness of his military strategies, which emphasized speed, surprise, and coordinated movements. His armies became symbols of French power, feared by enemies and admired by allies. Yet the empire was not without challenges. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required constant military engagement. Many regions resisted French rule, and uprisings occurred in places like Spain, where guerrilla fighters weakened French occupation forces. Economic warfare also played a critical role. Napoleon attempted to cut off Britain from European markets through a policy known as the Continental System. The goal was to weaken Britain's economy by restricting trade, but the plan proved difficult to enforce and often harmed French allies as much as it affected Britain. While Napoleon was expanding his European empire, he faced significant challenges in the colonies. The decision to reintroduce slavery in French territories after the Revolution's earlier abolition led to fierce resistance, particularly in the Caribbean. In Saint-Domingue, a powerful movement for independence was already underway, led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture. The attempt to restore French control over the island failed, and the colony eventually became the independent nation of Haiti. This event had global implications. It was the first successful revolt of enslaved people leading to an independent state, and it permanently altered France's colonial ambitions in the Americas. Furthermore, France's difficulties in the Caribbean contributed to Napoleon's decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Reshaping the future of North America back in Europe, the empire reached its greatest extent, but its size made it fragile. The turning point came with Napoleon's decision to invade Russia. The campaign began with confidence, but soon descended into catastrophe. Russian forces retreated deeper into their territory, using scorched earth tactics to deny French troops supplies. The harsh winter, combined with disease, hunger, and exhaustion, devastated the Grand Army. Only a small fraction of the soldiers who had marched into Russia survived the journey home. This failure encouraged Napoleon's enemies, who formed new coalitions determined to defeat him. The wars that followed gradually pushed French forces back. Napoleon's control over Europe began to crumble as Allied armies advanced. Eventually, he was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Though the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, Napoleon's story did not end there. He escaped from Elba, returned to France, and regained power for a brief period known as the 100 Days. But his final defeat at Waterloo marked the end of his rule and the collapse of the First French Empire. The fall of Napoleon left France in a state of exhaustion, militarily, economically, and politically. Yet, it also left the country transformed. The old structures of authority had been weakened, new ideas about citizenship had taken root, and the nation's identity had shifted after years of revolution and empire. The early 19th century became a period of reconstruction and redefining, during which France attempted to reconcile its turbulent past with a future that demanded stability. At the same time, the monarchy sought to reassert itself and guide the kingdom into a new era of modernization and overseas ambition. After Napoleon's first abdication, the victorious European powers restored the Bourbon dynasty, placing Louis XVIII on the throne. His reign began with a delicate balancing act. On one side were royalists who wanted a complete return to pre-revolutionary traditions. On the other were citizens who had lived through decades of sweeping change and refused to surrender the rights and freedoms they had gained. Louis XVIII understood that he could not simply erase the revolution. He introduced a constitutional charter that recognized civil liberties, legal equality, and a representative legislature, even as it re-established the monarchy. The charter created a political system that mixed old and new elements. It preserved certain privileges for the nobility and the church, but also affirmed principles such as equality before the law and protection of property. The government was divided into a chamber of peers, whose members were appointed by the king, and a chamber of deputies, elected by citizens who met property requirements. Although this structure limited broad participation, it offered a platform for political debate and introduced a measure of accountability to royal rule. Louis XVIII's leadership brought a period of relative calm, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Many royalists believed the revolution had gone too far, while many liberals believed it had not gone far enough. These disagreements became more pronounced after Louis XVIII's death, when his brother, Charles X, came to the throne. Charles X admired pre-revolutionary traditions and sought to strengthen the authority of the monarchy. His policies attempted to restore privileges to the Catholic Church, compensate nobles who had lost property during the Revolution, and impose greater control over the press. These measures alarmed liberals and moderate reformers. They feared that Charles X intended to roll back the gains of the previous decades. His growing resistance to constitutional limits placed him on a collision course with a society that had become increasingly aware of its political voice. Economic pressures worsened the situation. Industrial growth brought change to French cities, creating a new class of workers, merchants, and professionals who demanded more political representation. The conflict reached a breaking point when Charles X issued the July Ordinances, a set of decrees that restricted the press, reduced the electorate, and attempted to strengthen royal power. The reaction in Paris was immediate and dramatic. Citizens took to the streets in a wave of protest that became known as the July Revolution. Barricades appeared in the capital, echoing earlier revolutionary struggles. After several days of fighting, Charles X realized that he could not suppress the uprising without risking widespread violence. He abdicated the throne and left France. The July Revolution did not abolish the monarchy, but it replaced Charles X with a more moderate ruler. Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, accepted the crown and became known as the Citizen King. His rule, known as the July Monarchy, presented itself as a compromise between royal authority and popular representation. Louis Philippe dressed plainly, highlighted his connection to the revolution, and attempted to appeal to the growing middle class. The political system under his reign expanded voting rights slightly, although they remained limited to a wealthy minority. The July Monarchy brought a period of relative stability and economic progress. France experienced significant industrial expansion. Railways spread across the country, linking cities and markets in new ways. Factories multiplied, producing everything from textiles to machinery. Urban centers such as Paris, Lyon, and Lille grew as people migrated from rural areas seeking work. A stronger banking system emerged to support industry and trade. Merchants and financiers gained influence, contributing to the rise of a new economic elite. These changes, however, created new forms of social tension. While the middle class benefited from economic expansion, many workers lived in harsh conditions with low wages and few protections. Strikes, protests, and calls for social reform increased. France's growing urban population demanded improvements in housing, sanitation, and public health, areas in which the government struggled to keep pace with rapid industrialization. Internationally, the July Monarchy pursued a more assertive foreign policy, particularly in overseas expansion. One of the most significant developments was the French invasion of Algeria. The origins of this campaign lay in a dispute between the French government and the ruler of Algiers, but the decision to launch a military expedition was also driven by political motives. The monarchy hoped that a successful foreign venture would strengthen national pride, distract from domestic tensions, and expand France's influence. The invasion began with a landing near Algiers, followed by the city's capture. What initially appeared to be a swift operation soon turned into a prolonged and brutal conflict. Algeria was not a territory that could be easily subdued. Various tribes and leaders resisted French control, most notably Abd al-Qadir, who organized a sustained and determined resistance movement. His leadership united many communities in the struggle against occupation. The French military response grew increasingly harsh as the war continued. Villages were destroyed, crops were burned, and civilians were displaced. Despite substantial resistance, France gradually expanded its control over the region. The occupation of Algeria marked the beginning of a new kind of French imperialism, one that aimed not only to extract resources but also to settle French citizens and reshape local society. Large numbers of Europeans began migrating to Algeria, encouraged by the promise of land and economic opportunity. Beyond Algeria, France sought to strengthen its presence in West Africa, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. These efforts involved expanding trading posts, securing control over coastal regions, and increasing involvement in local politics. Although the results varied from region to region, the overall pattern showed that France was once again positioning itself as a global power. Cultural changes also emerged during the July monarchy. French art, literature, and science continued to flourish. Writers such as Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac explored themes of poverty, social change, and political struggle, capturing the complex realities of a society in transition. Scientific institutions expanded, reflecting the kingdom's commitment to education and innovation. Yet the growing divide between the wealthy and the poor, and between political elites and ordinary citizens, remained a persistent source of frustration. The fall of the July monarchy left France at a crossroads once again. Economic frustration, political exclusion, and growing demands for broader participation had shaken public confidence in the existing order. In this climate of uncertainty, the nation sought stability and direction. The figure who emerged to fill this role was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. His name alone carried powerful associations with glory, stability, and national pride, and he used that legacy to build a new political path that blended modern ideas with authoritarian rule. This era, known as the Second Empire, reshaped France domestically and internationally, introducing sweeping modernization at home while expanding French ambitions abroad. Louis Napoleon was elected president of the Second Republic. His victory reflected both nostalgia for his uncle's achievements and widespread desire for strong leadership. Yet the Constitution of the Republic placed limits on presidential power, particularly by preventing the president from seeking consecutive terms. Unwilling to step aside and convinced that the country required firm guidance, Louis Napoleon orchestrated a coup that dissolved the legislature and restructured the political system. He presented these changes as necessary to protect national unity and economic progress. After securing widespread support through a national vote, he declared himself emperor, taking the title Napoleon III. Under Napoleon III, France entered a period of rapid modernization. One of the most transformative projects of his reign was the redesign of Paris. The medieval city, with its narrow, winding streets, crowded neighborhoods, and poor sanitation, was ill-equipped for a growing urban population. Napoleon III appointed Baron Haussmann to oversee a massive reconstruction. Haussmann carved wide boulevards through the city, replacing old alleyways with grand avenues lined by modern buildings. New parks, public squares, and improved sewer systems made the city cleaner, brighter, and more organized. This urban transformation served multiple purposes. It improved public health, facilitated commerce, increased the movement of goods and people, and provided a more visually unified capital. However, these changes also had political motives. The wider streets reduced the likelihood of barricades being constructed during uprisings, giving the government greater control should unrest arise. Haussmann's redesign left a lasting imprint, turning Paris into a symbol of modernity and architectural harmony. Industrialization accelerated during the Second Empire. Railways expanded across France, connecting distant regions and strengthening economic ties. Factories multiplied, producing a growing range of goods. Iron and steel industries grew, supported by new mining efforts and improved infrastructure. The government encouraged investment, offered loans, and reduced barriers to enterprise. As a result, France experienced rising employment and increased production, and new urban centers emerged as hubs of industry and trade. Agriculture also benefited from modernization. Advances in equipment and farming techniques improved productivity. Rural regions gained better access to markets thanks to the expanding railway network. Though many peasants continued to face difficult conditions, the overall agricultural output increased, supporting population growth and contributing to the national economy. While domestic transformation was underway, Napoleon III pursued an active foreign policy aimed at elevating France's international standing. He believed that France should play a leading role in global affairs, and that expanding influence abroad would reinforce his legitimacy at home. This vision shaped French involvement in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In North Africa, France deepened its control over Algeria, which had first been invaded during the July monarchy under Napoleon III. Colonization intensified. European settlers continued to migrate to the region. Encouraged by promises of fertile land and economic opportunity, French authorities established new administrative structures and expanded military outposts. Although the emperor expressed interest in respecting the rights of local populations, the reality on the ground was far more complex. Indigenous communities faced increasing pressure from expanding settlements, and French rule frequently relied on coercion to maintain order. In West Africa, France strengthened its foothold along the Senegal River. Leaders such as Louis Faidherbe expanded French influence through a combination of diplomacy, trade, and military action. Trading posts developed into stronger bases of power, laying the groundwork for deeper penetration into the interior in the decades ahead. French ambitions in Asia also grew significantly during this era. France became increasingly involved in Indochina, beginning with missionary activity and eventually expanding into direct territorial control. The desire to protect Catholic missionaries and secure access to trade routes drove French intervention. Initial footholds in the region would evolve into a full colonial presence, marking the early stages of an empire that would later encompass Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Perhaps the most dramatic foreign adventure of the Second Empire occurred in the Americas. Napoleon III supported an effort to place Archduke Maximilian of Austria on the throne of Mexico. This intervention reflected the emperor's vision of spreading French influence and establishing a friendly monarchy in the Western Hemisphere. Yet the project proved disastrous. Resistance from Mexican nationalists, combined with pressure from the United States, which opposed European interference in the region, ultimately doomed the effort. Maximilian was captured and executed, and France withdrew its forces. This failure damaged Napoleon III's prestige. Despite setbacks, the empire achieved other international successes. France participated in the Crimean War alongside Britain and the Ottoman Empire, opposing Russian expansion. The conflict ended with a victory for the Allied forces, and France gained diplomatic influence in Europe. The emperor also supported Italian unification movements, though his involvement was cautious and shaped by shifting political calculations. Within France, however, political opposition grew as the years passed. Napoleon III initially maintained tight control over the press and political assembly, but public pressure eventually pushed him toward limited liberalization. Restrictions were eased, allowing for more open debate and expanding the role of elected representatives. This shift aimed to secure broader support for the regime, but it also emboldened critics who argued that the empire remained too authoritarian. Economic challenges also emerged. While industrialization had generated wealth, it had also created inequality and strained working conditions. Urban workers demanded better wages, improved safety, and a greater voice in politics. Strikes and protests became more common, revealing the social tensions beneath the surface of economic growth. The greatest blow to the Second Empire came from outside France. Napoleon III's foreign policy became increasingly risky, and the growing power of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck posed a significant threat. The rivalry between France and Prussia intensified, driven by concerns over influence in Europe. When diplomatic tensions escalated over the question of succession to the Spanish throne, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia, hoping to demonstrate French strength and restore his fading popularity. The collapse of the Second Empire during the Franco-Prussian War left France devastated and humiliated. Defeat on the battlefield, the capture of Napoleon III, and the loss of territories such as Alsace and part of Lorraine created a painful national crisis. Out of this crisis emerged a new political system known as the Third Republic. Though born from chaos and uncertainty, this republic would become the longest-lasting government France had ever known up to that point. It would also preside over one of the most significant expansions of the French colonial empire, a period sometimes called the High Empire. The early years of the Third Republic were marked by turmoil. After the fall of Napoleon III, France attempted to continue fighting the war, but resistance collapsed, and the German army surrounded Paris. The government fled to Bordeaux, and the city endured a harsh siege. The eventual peace agreement forced France to pay a massive indemnity and cede territory, deepening the sense of national trauma. When the government returned to Paris, it faced immediate rebellion from radical workers and citizens who believed the new leadership was too willing to compromise with conservative forces. This uprising, known as the Paris Commune, briefly established an autonomous government in the capital. The communards called for political and social reforms, including worker control of factories and a more egalitarian society. Their experiment lasted only a short time. The national government responded with overwhelming force, retaking Paris in a violent confrontation that left deep scars. The suppression of the Commune reaffirmed the authority of the new Republican government, but also exposed the sharp divisions between conservatives, moderates, and radicals within French society. Despite its turbulent origins, the Third Republic began building a more stable political system. The Republic's leaders created institutions aimed at balancing different political forces. A president served as head of state with largely symbolic powers, while real authority rested in the elected parliament. Though political factions frequently clashed, the Republic endured by allowing competition and debate rather than silencing opposition. Over time, Republican ideals took root, including support for public education, secularism, and civic participation. One of the major achievements of the Third Republic was the development of a national education system. Leaders such as Jules Ferry believed that free, compulsory, and secular education was essential for creating informed citizens who could participate in a democratic society. Schools became central places for promoting Republican values and diminishing the influence of the church in public life. Literacy rates improved dramatically, helping unify the diverse regions of France. While the Republic focused on rebuilding the nation, it also turned its attention outward. Colonial expansion had begun earlier, but under the Third Republic, it accelerated significantly. Leaders believed that expanding overseas would restore national pride after the defeat by Germany, strengthen the economy, and demonstrate France's status as a global power. This era saw France construct one of the largest empires in the world, stretching across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. The largest part of this expansion took place in Africa. In West Africa, French officials and military forces gradually extended control from coastal trading posts into vast inland regions. Leaders such as Louis Faidherbe and later colonial administrators pushed into territories that would eventually make up countries like Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Diplomatic agreements, military campaigns, and treaties with local rulers helped build the foundation of what became French West Africa. In Central Africa, France expanded into regions that later formed Equatorial Africa. Explorers and soldiers traveled along major rivers, establishing stations and negotiating with local leaders. The construction of new borders often ignored the realities of local ethnic groups and political systems, creating divisions whose consequences would last far beyond the colonial era. These territories became sources of raw materials such as rubber, timber, and minerals used to fuel French industrial growth. Madagascar, the large island off Africa's southeastern coast, became another target of French expansion. After years of diplomatic and military pressure, France established full control over the island, integrating it into the empire as a strategic and economic hub. French officials reorganized the island's governance, introduced new infrastructure, and sought to reshape local institutions in line with colonial priorities. In North Africa, Tunisia and later Morocco fell under French influence through a combination of economic pressure and military intervention. These protectorates allowed France to control foreign policy and economic development while maintaining the appearance of local rule. French authorities introduced reforms they believed would modernize the regions, but these reforms primarily served the interests of settlers and the colonial administration. Beyond Africa, France expanded significantly in Southeast Asia. Indochina emerged as one of the most important French colonial possessions of the era. Through military campaigns and diplomatic treaties, France established control over territories that today include Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Indochina became a hub of economic activity and a symbol of French imperial ambition. Rubber plantations, mines, and ports contributed to the empire's economic output, though they relied heavily on local labor and strict colonial regulations. The Pacific also drew French attention. Territories such as New Caledonia, Tahiti, and other island groups came under French control, serving strategic and economic purposes. Some became sites for penal colonies, while others provided opportunities for trade and missionary activity. As the empire expanded, French leaders developed an ideology to justify their actions. They promoted the idea of a civilizing mission, arguing that France had a duty to bring education, modernity, and enlightenment to the peoples it ruled. This ideology presented colonialism as a benevolent project, but in practice, it often served to mask systems of economic exploitation, cultural domination, and racial hierarchy. Indigenous institutions were weakened or replaced, and European settlers gained privileged status over local populations. Despite the contradictions of colonial rule, the empire became central to the identity of the Third Republic. Colonial exhibitions in cities like Paris celebrated the diversity of the empire and showcased France's global presence. These events displayed artifacts, cultural performances, and products from colonial regions, promoting national pride and reinforcing the image of France as a world power. At the same time, the empire played a crucial role in the French economy. Colonies supplied raw materials, agricultural products, and labor. They also served as markets for French goods, helping support domestic industries. Railways, ports, and administrative systems built in colonial regions were designed primarily to serve French economic interests, not local development. Nevertheless, these projects reshaped the landscapes and social structures of the regions involved. Within France, the growing empire influenced politics and society. Debates over the role of colonialism, the treatment of indigenous populations, and the cost of maintaining overseas territories became regular features of public discourse. Socialist and liberal critics denounced abuses and argued that colonial expansion contradicted the Republic's values of liberty and equality. Meanwhile, nationalists and conservatives defended imperialism as essential for national strength and prestige. The international environment added further complexity. As European powers competed for control over territory, tensions rose, particularly in regions like Africa and Asia. Diplomatic negotiations attempted to prevent conflict, but rivalries simmered beneath the surface. These rivalries would eventually help shape the conditions leading to the First World War. When the 20th century began, France controlled a sprawling overseas empire and had developed a strong republican identity at home. Yet beneath this outward confidence lay anxieties shaped by the loss of Alsace and part of Lorraine, the rise of Germany as a formidable industrial and military power, and the uncertainty created by competing alliances across Europe. These tensions escalated rapidly, and when the First World War erupted, France found itself at the center of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The war would test the strength of the French Republic, reshape its society, deepen its reliance on colonial subjects, and leave scars that would endure long after the fighting stopped. The war began after a series of diplomatic crises and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Europe had divided into two major alliance systems: the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allied Powers, including France, Britain, and later, many others. When Germany declared war on France, the conflict ignited with a speed that surprised even experienced statesmen. The French military mobilized under the framework of its long-standing plan for war, known as Plan 17, which called for a rapid offensive into German territory. This strategy reflected a belief in national spirit and offensive momentum, but it underestimated the strength of German defenses and the brutality of modern industrial warfare. Early French offensives suffered heavy losses. German forces advanced through Belgium, violating its neutrality, and pushed deep into northern France. The fighting reached the outskirts of Paris, creating a sense of national emergency. In response, French and British forces launched a counteroffensive at the Marne River. Their success halted the German advance and prevented a swift defeat. This moment lifted French morale, but it also marked the beginning of a long and grueling stalemate. Trench warfare defined the next phase of the conflict. Massive networks of trenches stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, creating landscapes of mud, barbed wire, and devastation. Soldiers endured constant bombardment, disease, and the psychological strain of living in confined, dangerous conditions. New weapons, such as machine guns, poison gas, and heavy artillery, made traditional battlefield tactics increasingly deadly. The Western Front became a symbol of the war's brutality, with battles that lasted months and cost countless lives for only minor territorial gains. Throughout these years, France relied heavily on the strength of its empire. Colonial soldiers and workers from across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean played a crucial role in the war effort. Troops from Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Indochina, and Madagascar were mobilized to fight on French soil. These soldiers served in infantry units, logistic support roles, and specialized battalions. Though they fought bravely, they often faced discrimination, difficult living conditions, and policies that separated them from French soldiers, yet their contribution was essential. Without the empire, France would have struggled to maintain the manpower needed for such a prolonged conflict. In addition to soldiers, France recruited laborers from its colonies to work in munitions factories, farms, and logistical networks. These workers kept the economy functioning while so many French men served on the front lines. Colonial workers helped supply ammunition, build fortifications, and keep transportation routes open. Their efforts underscored the deep interdependence between the metropolitan homeland and its overseas territories. On the home front, civilians faced increasing hardship. The German occupation of northern and northeastern regions brought shortages, exploitation, and forced labor. Families across France endured rationing, inflation, and the constant fear of receiving news that a loved one had been killed or injured. Women took on roles in factories, farms, and offices, filling positions left vacant by men at the front. Their expanded responsibilities shifted social expectations and contributed to long-term changes in gender roles. The French government, led by leaders such as Georges Clemenceau, worked to maintain national unity. Clemenceau, known as the Tiger, emphasized determination and sacrifice. He rallied the country behind the idea that France had no choice but to fight until victory was secured. His speeches and leadership helped sustain morale during some of the war's darkest periods. As the conflict dragged on, major battles such as Verdun and the Somme became defining moments of suffering and endurance. At Verdun, French forces held their ground against a colossal German offensive, despite staggering casualties. The battle became a symbol of national resilience. At the Somme, British and French forces attempted a massive breakthrough, only to witness immense loss of life with minimal gains. These battles demonstrated the scale of modern warfare and the enormous human cost required to sustain it. International dynamics eventually shifted the balance. The entry of the United States into the war strengthened the Allied powers both economically and militarily. Fresh American troops arrived in Europe, boosting morale and providing much-needed reinforcement. At the same time, Germany faced internal crisis, economic collapse, and exhaustion. By the war's final year, Allied forces launched a series of coordinated offensives that pushed German armies back across the Western Front. When an armistice was finally signed, France emerged on the side of victory, but the cost had been devastating. Millions had died or been wounded, entire regions were destroyed, and the country faced immense financial and social challenges. Northern towns had been reduced to rubble, farmland ruined, and industry crippled. The French population was deeply traumatized. Memorials, cemeteries, and monuments later appeared across the country, honoring the sacrifices made and acknowledging the enormity of the loss. The empire had also been deeply affected. Colonial soldiers returned home with mixed feelings. Many were proud of their service, but expected greater recognition, rights, and opportunities as a result of their contributions. Some demanded reforms or political change. Their experiences in the war exposed them to ideas of nationalism, self-determination, and equality. Concepts that would influence future anti-colonial movements. France gained new territories after the war, especially in the Middle East, where mandates in Syria and Lebanon expanded the empire. Yet these acquisitions also came with responsibilities and tensions. Local populations often viewed French rule with suspicion or resistance, creating new political challenges. One of the most significant long-term effects of the war was its impact on European politics. France sought security and reparations from Germany, hoping to prevent another conflict and rebuild the economy. The Treaty of Versailles imposed strict conditions on Germany, including limits on its military and heavy financial obligations. While many in France believed these measures were necessary, others warned that harsh terms might lead to future instability. Within France itself, the war altered political and social structures. Veterans returned, demanding better treatment and greater support. The role of women in society changed permanently as their contributions during the war raised questions about their rights and status. The economy required reconstruction, and new industries emerged to meet modern needs. The scars of war shaped national memory, influencing culture, literature, and public debate. The end of the First World War brought a mixture of relief, pride, and sorrow to France. The country had survived one of the deadliest conflicts in world history and emerged on the victorious side. Yet the cost had been enormous. Vast regions lay in ruins. Millions were dead or wounded, and the psychological burden weighed heavily on the population. As the 1920s began, France sought to rebuild itself, assert its place in the new global order, and manage the responsibilities of an expanded empire. But the optimism of victory soon gave way to political instability, economic strain, and growing international danger. These forces, combined with deep tensions inside the French colonial empire, ultimately contributed to the catastrophic collapse of 1940. In the immediate post-war years, France focused on reconstruction. The devastated northern regions required extensive rebuilding. Towns, railways, mines, and farms had to be restored. The government invested heavily in infrastructure, but these efforts required significant financial resources. To cover the costs, France depended on reparations from Germany, as outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. Many French leaders believed that Germany should finance the reconstruction since German armies had inflicted the damage. However, collecting reparations proved far more difficult than expected. Germany struggled with inflation, political instability, and widespread resentment toward the treaty's terms. When payments fell behind, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr region in an attempt to enforce compliance. This move intensified tensions and contributed to economic complications that would later affect the entire European economy. Although some reparations were eventually paid, they never fully matched France's expectations. Politically, the Third Republic faced significant challenges. Its system depended on shifting coalitions in parliament, making stable government difficult. Cabinets rose and fell frequently, sometimes lasting only months. While democracy remained intact, the constant turnover weakened public confidence. Political parties were divided across ideological lines. Conservatives defended traditional values and the importance of the church, while socialists pushed for workers' rights, expanded democracy, and social reforms. The rise of new far-right groups, inspired by nationalist and authoritarian ideas, added further complexity. Despite these tensions, the 1920s witnessed cultural and social dynamism. France experienced a period often referred to as the Années Folles, or the Crazy Years. Cities like Paris became global centers of art, literature, music, and intellectual experimentation. Writers such as Ernest Hemingway and painters of the modernist movement gathered in cafes, exchanging ideas that helped shape global culture. Jazz music flourished, fashion evolved rapidly, and cinema grew in importance. This cultural vibrancy, however, masked the underlying vulnerabilities of French society. The French colonial empire continued to expand and consolidate during this period. The mandates acquired in the Middle East, Syria, and Lebanon required new administrative structures. France attempted to introduce forms of modern governance, but faced criticism and resistance from local populations who viewed foreign rule with suspicion. In Africa, the French expanded infrastructure, promoted cash crops such as peanuts and cotton, and sought to integrate colonies more tightly into the imperial economic system. Colonial administrators often justified their presence by invoking the idea of a civilizing mission, but many of their policies were designed to extract resources and enforce control. However, the empire faced growing demands for reform. The First World War had exposed the contradictions of French colonialism. Colonial troops had fought and died alongside French soldiers. Laborers from Africa and Asia had contributed to the war effort. Many returned home with a heightened awareness of global politics and the ideals of self-determination. Intellectuals in colonies such as Vietnam, Senegal, and Algeria began articulating demands for greater political participation, economic opportunity, and ultimately increased autonomy or independence. The global economy played a decisive role in shaping the interwar period. The Great Depression, which began with a financial crisis in the United States, spread rapidly across the world. France initially seemed insulated from the worst effects because it maintained a cautious fiscal policy and adhered to the gold standard longer than many other countries. However, as international trade collapsed and demand for goods declined, French industry suffered. Unemployment rose, and economic stagnation fueled political discontent. Political divisions intensified. The far right grew stronger, inspired by authoritarian regimes in Italy and Germany. Meanwhile, socialists and communists gained support among workers and intellectuals who believed that capitalism had failed. The growing polarization of French politics reflected wider anxieties across Europe. Some citizens feared that democracy was too weak and indecisive to protect national security, while others believed that only radical reform could address deep social inequalities. In response to growing threats from the far right, left-wing parties formed a coalition known as the Popular Front. This alliance won legislative elections and introduced social reforms aimed at improving workers' lives, including paid vacation and shorter working hours. Although these reforms brought hope to many ordinary citizens, the government faced strong opposition from conservatives and business groups. Economic problems persisted, and ideological tensions grew even sharper. While political battles consumed attention at home, a more dangerous threat loomed across the border. Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, rearmed rapidly and pursued an aggressive foreign policy. Hitler repudiated the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilt the military, and annexed territories. France, deeply traumatized by the memory of the First World War, adopted a strategy centered on defense. The construction of the Maginot Line, a long network of fortifications along the German border, symbolized this defensive mindset. French leaders believed that the line would prevent a direct German invasion and provide the country with time to mobilize if needed. However, this focus on defensive fortifications also reflected deeper uncertainties. The nation lacked political unity, military morale was uneven, and public opinion was divided about how to respond to German aggression. Some argued for stronger alliances and a more assertive military posture, while others feared provoking another devastating war. The outbreak of the Second World War revealed the weaknesses of France's strategy. When Germany invaded Poland, France declared war but initially took little offensive action. This period of relative quiet on the Western Front became known as the Phony War. Yet behind the calm, France struggled with logistical problems, outdated military doctrines, and internal disagreements among commanders. The German invasion in 1940 shattered any illusions of security. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified Maginot Line directly, German forces bypassed it by advancing through the Ardennes, a region the French military had considered too difficult for large-scale movement. The German army used rapid, coordinated tactics, combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry to break through French defenses with alarming speed. French units found themselves overwhelmed, outmaneuvered, and often cut off from supply lines. Communications failed, leadership faltered, and panic spread. As German forces advanced, the French government fell into crisis. Civilian and military leaders disagreed on strategy, and refugees flooded the roads as civilians fled approaching armies. The collapse came faster than anyone in France had imagined possible. Within weeks, German troops entered Paris. The government faced a terrible choice: flee and continue fighting from overseas, or negotiate an armistice. A faction led by Marshal Philippe Pétain argued that continued resistance would lead to complete destruction. He negotiated an armistice with Germany that divided France into occupied and unoccupied zones. The unoccupied region became the base for the Vichy regime, a government that collaborated with German authorities and adopted authoritarian policies of its own. Meanwhile, other French leaders, including a relatively unknown general named Charles de Gaulle, refused to accept defeat. Speaking from exile, de Gaulle called upon the French people to continue resisting, laying the groundwork for the Free French movement. The collapse of France in 1940 marked one of the most dramatic turning points in modern French history. The nation that once stood among Europe's great powers found itself defeated, occupied, and politically fractured. Yet out of this crisis emerged new forms of leadership, resistance, and imperial involvement that would shape the future of the country. The Second World War became not only a battle for France's territorial survival, but also a struggle over its political identity and the allegiance of its vast colonial empire. The path to liberation would run through Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific, connecting millions of people across continents. The armistice signed with Germany established two zones in France: an occupied northern region under direct German control and an unoccupied southern region governed by the new Vichy regime led by Marshal Philippe Pétain. The Vichy government claimed to represent continuity and order, presenting the defeat as a reason to abandon the democratic values of the Third Republic. The regime promoted authoritarian rule, strict hierarchy, and collaboration with Nazi Germany. It imposed policies that restricted civil liberties, persecuted political opponents, and cooperated in the deportation of Jews. For many French citizens, the fall of France and the creation of the Vichy regime created a profound moral and political crisis. Some believed collaboration was necessary to prevent further destruction, while others viewed it as a betrayal of national values. The country became divided between those who accepted Vichy's authority and those who sought ways to resist occupation. Amid this turmoil, a relatively little-known general named Charles de Gaulle refused to accept defeat. Escaping to Britain, he delivered a radio broadcast encouraging the French people to continue resisting. His speech, carried across Europe, declared that the struggle for France was not over. Though only a small number joined him initially, de Gaulle's message laid the foundation for what would become the Free French movement. The role of the French colonial empire proved decisive in this early phase of resistance. While mainland France lay under occupation, the empire offered territory, resources, and manpower that could support continued opposition to Germany, yet the empire itself was divided. Some colonial leaders pledged allegiance to Vichy, while others supported de Gaulle or shifted their position as the war progressed. French Equatorial Africa became the first major region to rally to free France. Leaders such as Félix Éboué, the governor of Chad, declared loyalty to de Gaulle and provided strategic bases for Allied operations. This support allowed the Free French forces to establish a presence on the African continent, enabling further recruitment and organizing military operations. In other parts of the empire, allegiance was contested. In French West Africa, Vichy authorities initially remained in control. The Allies attempted to gain influence in the region, most notably during the operation aimed at seizing Dakar. Although that effort failed to shift local loyalties immediately, pressure continued to grow as the war advanced. North Africa became a major battleground for influence between Vichy and Free French forces. When the Allies launched Operation Torch, a massive invasion of North Africa, they aimed to secure the region and open a new front against Axis forces. After negotiations and military confrontation, Vichy officials in North Africa eventually joined the Allied cause. This development provided the Allies with vital bases and allowed French forces in the region to join the broader effort to liberate Europe. The conflict also reached the Middle East, where Syria and Lebanon, then under French mandate, became arenas of strategic competition. British and Free French forces moved into the region to prevent it from falling under Axis influence. After fierce fighting, these territories came under Free French administration. Although the conflict caused tension with local populations, it further strengthened Free France's position and highlighted the global reach of the struggle beyond Africa and the Middle East. The Pacific played a smaller but symbolically significant role. Territories such as New Caledonia and Polynesian Islands aligned with Free France, providing naval bases and strategic points for Allied operations. These distant territories reinforced the notion that France continued to exist as a fighting power, despite the occupation of its homeland. As Free France gained territory and legitimacy, de Gaulle worked to establish a political and administrative structure that could represent France internationally. He created the French National Committee and later, the French Committee of National Liberation, aiming to unify resistance movements and prepare for the post-war future. Maintaining independence from British and American control was a constant concern for de Gaulle, who insisted that France should not be reduced to the status of a minor power. Meanwhile, resistance inside France grew steadily. Networks of underground groups formed across cities and rural areas, engaging in acts of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and the spread of clandestine newspapers. These groups included communists, socialists, Gaullists, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept occupation. Although divided by ideology, the various resistance movements gradually coordinated their efforts, especially as Allied victories strengthened hopes of eventual liberation. Women played crucial roles in the resistance, serving as couriers, organizers, and intelligence agents. Their work demonstrated the depth of commitment to national liberation and challenged traditional gender expectations in French society. Many paid with their lives, facing execution or deportation. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, France's liberation became increasingly likely. The invasion of North Africa had opened a path for Free French forces to rebuild their military strength. Troops from across the empire, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Senegal, Chad, Madagascar, Indochina, and other territories, joined the fight. These soldiers formed a diverse and essential component of the French forces that advanced through Italy and later participated in the liberation of France. The Allied invasion of Normandy marked the beginning of the end for German occupation. French resistance groups provided intelligence and launched coordinated uprisings to support the liberation effort. Free French forces, now a unified fighting force with troops from across the empire, participated in the battle. The liberation of Paris became a defining moment. De Gaulle insisted that French forces should enter the city first, a symbolic gesture to affirm national sovereignty. When the capital was freed, massive crowds gathered to celebrate the return of French authority. Following liberation, the provisional government led by de Gaulle set about restoring order, reorganizing institutions, and purging collaborators. The experience of occupation had fractured French society. Some had resisted bravely, while others had collaborated or simply tried to survive under difficult circumstances. The process of reconciliation and justice was complex, reflecting the moral challenges created by years of division. The empire's wartime role reshaped its relationship with France. Colonial soldiers and workers had made enormous sacrifices, often fighting in harsh conditions far from home. Their contributions raised expectations for political change, Ideas of equality, nationalism, and self-determination, strengthened by wartime service and global discourse, began to circulate more widely. In some regions, wartime mobilization had inadvertently created political networks that would later fuel independence movements. When the Second World War finally came to an end, France emerged battered but unbowed. Liberation had restored national pride, and the provisional government led by Charles de Gaulle began the difficult task of rebuilding the shattered nation. But beneath the relief of victory lay deeper questions about the country's political future and the fate of its vast colonial empire. The war had shaken every part of French society, weakened the old political order, and awakened new demands for freedom and equality across the colonized world. The years that followed would reveal just how profoundly the conflict had altered the relationship between France and its empire. After liberation, de Gaulle sought to stabilize the country and establish a government capable of guiding reconstruction. However, disagreements quickly surfaced among political parties about the structure of the new state. The Communist Party, strengthened by its resistance activities during the war, favored a powerful parliament. Christian Democrats and Socialists supported various reforms but disagreed on the balance of authority. De Gaulle, by contrast, believed that France needed a strong executive to avoid the instability that had plagued the Third Republic. When the Assembly rejected his proposals, he resigned, setting the stage for the creation of the Fourth Republic. The Fourth Republic's constitution established a parliamentary system with a largely symbolic presidency and a prime minister dependent on shifting coalitions. Although democratic, this system inherited the weaknesses of the earlier republic. Governments rose and fell frequently, often lasting only months. Political fragmentation made decisive action difficult, particularly as France faced enormous tasks: rebuilding its economy, restoring infrastructure, and managing the changing dynamics of its empire. Despite political instability, France experienced significant economic recovery. Aid from the Marshall Plan helped rebuild industries, modernize factories, and stabilize finances. Urban centers were reconstructed, new housing projects were built, and modern technologies entered daily life. Consumer goods such as household appliances and automobiles became more accessible, marking a shift toward a more modern, urbanized society. Yet, alongside reconstruction came the most challenging issue of the era: the future of the French colonial empire. During the war, colonial soldiers and workers had played an essential role in France's survival. Many had fought bravely in North Africa, Europe, and beyond. Their service raised expectations for greater political rights, equality, and self-determination. The global climate after the war also encouraged independence movements. The new United Nations Charter emphasized principles of sovereignty and human rights, adding international pressure on empires to consider decolonization. French leaders, however, hoped to maintain the empire by transforming it rather than dissolving it. They introduced the idea of the French Union, a political structure intended to unite France and its colonies in a cooperative framework. In theory, it offered greater recognition and representation for colonial populations. In practice, it preserved French authority and fell short of the political aspirations of colonized peoples. Local leaders who returned from war or who had been educated in French schools were increasingly aware of global movements for independence and deeply dissatisfied with reforms that did not address fundamental inequalities. These tensions erupted first in Indochina. Vietnam had been under French rule since the 19th century, but the war transformed the region. Japanese occupation weakened French control, and resistance movements gained momentum. When the war ended, Vietnamese nationalists led by Ho Chi Minh declared independence. France, determined to restore authority, attempted to re-establish control over the region. Negotiations broke down, and violent conflict erupted, marking the beginning of the First Indochina War. The war in Indochina became a long and difficult struggle. French forces found themselves fighting guerrilla armies that used knowledge of the terrain and popular support to resist colonial domination. The conflict drained financial resources, stretched military capabilities, and increasingly divided public opinion in France. As the war continued, it became clear that France could not easily reassert control in a world where anti-colonial sentiment was rising. After years of bitter fighting, the French army suffered a decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu. This loss forced France to negotiate a settlement that ended colonial rule in Vietnam and led to the eventual independence of Laos and Cambodia as well. Even as the conflict in Indochina drew to a close, unrest was intensifying in North Africa. Algeria, unlike other colonies, was considered an integral part of France. Large populations of French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, lived there, and the region had been under French control for more than a century. But Algerian Muslims, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, faced discrimination in political representation, land ownership, and civil rights. The gap between settlers and indigenous people grew wider each year. Inspired by global anti-colonial movements and frustrated by decades of inequality, many Algerian nationalists concluded that peaceful reform was impossible. In this tense atmosphere, the Algerian War of Independence erupted. It began with coordinated attacks by the National Liberation Front, or FLN, against military and civilian targets. The French government initially underestimated the movement, believing that strong military action would suppress the revolt. Instead, the conflict escalated into one of the most brutal wars of decolonization in the 20th century. French forces employed harsh tactics, including mass arrests, torture, and the destruction of villages suspected of supporting insurgents. The FLN used guerrilla warfare, bombings, and targeted assassinations. The war spilled into the cities, most notably with a devastating campaign in Algiers, where French paratroopers and police forces carried out widespread repression. The violence shocked French society and sparked heated debates about the morality of colonial rule and the methods used to defend it. The Algerian War deeply divided France. Some citizens supported continued control, arguing that Algeria was inseparable from France. Others believed that holding on to Algeria was morally wrong, politically impossible, and economically damaging. The conflict destabilized the Fourth Republic's fragile political system. Governments fell one after another as leaders struggled to find a solution. The war also inflamed tensions between the French military and civilian authorities. Many officers believed political leaders were too hesitant and indecisive. Some began to feel betrayed by the government's wavering commitment. These frustrations reached a critical point when a group of military leaders in Algeria launched an uprising, believing they could force the government to adopt a harder line. The crisis threatened to bring civil war to France and convinced many political leaders that the current political system could not survive. In this moment of national danger, political leaders turned once again to Charles de Gaulle. The man who had led Free France during the Second World War was seen as the only figure capable of restoring stability. De Gaulle agreed to return, but on one condition: the constitution must be rewritten to give the executive branch stronger authority. France accepted his terms, marking the end of the Fourth Republic and paving the way for the birth of the Fifth Republic. Although many military officers believed de Gaulle would support continued French control in Algeria, he eventually recognized that independence was necessary. The war was tearing France apart, damaging international relations, and causing immense suffering. After a long and turbulent negotiation process, Algeria gained independence, marking the end of one of the fiercest struggles in colonial history. The birth of the Fifth Republic marked a new beginning for France. After years of political instability, bitter wars of decolonization, and divisions that threatened to tear the country apart, France needed a stronger and more durable political foundation. Charles de Gaulle, whose leadership during the Second World War had made him the symbol of national resistance, returned to power during the Algerian crisis and played the central role in shaping this new political order. Under the Fifth Republic, France redefined its institutions, its foreign policy, and its relationship with the territories that had once formed its vast empire. De Gaulle insisted that the Fifth Republic must correct the fundamental weaknesses that had plagued earlier systems. He believed that France needed a strong executive capable of guiding national policy without being crippled by factional disputes. The new constitution, approved by referendum, gave the presidency significant powers. The president now had authority over foreign policy, the armed forces, and key governmental decisions. The office of prime minister remained, but the president's role overshadowed it. This new structure created stability and allowed France to respond more effectively to crises. One of the earliest and most consequential decisions of the new republic was the resolution of the Algerian conflict. When de Gaulle returned to power, many supporters, especially in the military and among French settlers in Algeria, assumed he would maintain French control. Instead, he gradually concluded that the war could not be won, and that maintaining the colony would only deepen France's divisions. Through a combination of negotiations and military pressure, de Gaulle oversaw the process that led to Algerian independence. The decision angered many, including some officers who attempted to overthrow his government, but it allowed France to move forward. The end of the Algerian War marked the final major chapter of formal French imperialism. Yet, the retreat from empire did not mean the end of France's global influence. Instead, France began constructing new political, economic, and cultural ties with its former colonies, especially in Africa. This system would come to be known as France-Afrique, a network of relationships that combined cooperation, diplomacy, and, at times, covert intervention. In West and Central Africa, newly independent countries often retained close ties with France. French remained the language of government and education in many of these nations, and the French administration offered technical assistance to support new institutions. Economic agreements tied the economies of former colonies to French markets. A shared currency, the CFA franc, linked many African countries to the French financial system. These arrangements provided a degree of stability for new states, but also created dependencies that gave France significant influence over their policies. France's involvement in Africa went beyond economics. French military bases remained in several countries, and French troops intervened repeatedly to support governments or restore order during periods of unrest. While these actions were often justified as efforts to maintain stability, they also served French strategic interests and, at times, supported regimes with limited democratic legitimacy. The complexity of these relationships would later become the subject of intense debate, with critics arguing that France-Afrique allowed France to maintain informal control long after colonial rule had officially ended. At the same time, France's global role expanded through other avenues. De Gaulle pursued an independent foreign policy, distancing France from the tight alliance structures of the Cold War. Although France remained in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, de Gaulle withdrew French forces from the organization's integrated military command. He believed France should maintain the freedom to act independently and not be overshadowed by the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. This vision reflected his belief that France still had a unique voice to offer the world. To reinforce this independence, France developed its own nuclear weapons program. The creation of a French nuclear force, known as the Force de Frappe, was intended to ensure that France could defend itself without relying entirely on allies. The program also symbolized the nation's determination to remain a major global power in a world increasingly dominated by nuclear-armed states. Domestically, the Fifth Republic guided France through major economic and social transformation. The post-war years had already sparked rapid industrial growth, but under the Fifth Republic, this modernization accelerated. New motorways, factories, and housing projects reshaped the country. Urbanization increased as rural populations moved to cities in search of work. Immigration from former colonies and southern Europe brought new cultural influences and helped fuel economic expansion. education reforms expanded access to secondary and university education. New industries flourished, including aviation, nuclear energy, and modern telecommunications. State planning played a key role in directing economic development, reflecting a belief in combining market forces with strategic state intervention. Culturally, France continued to project influence far beyond its borders. French literature, cinema, and philosophy gained global recognition. Writers and thinkers explored themes of identity, colonial legacy, and modern social life. At the same time, cultural ties between France and its former colonies deepened. Many artists, intellectuals, and leaders from Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia studied or worked in France, contributing to a flourishing exchange of ideas. Yet the post-colonial era was not without tension. Immigration from former colonies led to the growth of new communities in French cities, bringing both cultural richness and social challenges. Issues of discrimination, integration, and identity became central to public debate. Some French citizens struggled to accept a multicultural society, while others argued that France's universalist ideals required full equality and participation for all residents, regardless of origin. Meanwhile, the rise of nationalist movements in African and Middle Eastern countries occasionally clashed with French interests. France intervened militarily in African conflicts multiple times, sometimes supporting governments aligned with its goals, and sometimes attempting to prevent coups that threatened regional stability. These interventions highlighted the complex legacy of empire in the modern era. France was no longer a colonial ruler, but it remained deeply entangled in the political trajectories of former colonies. The Fifth Republic itself continued to evolve. After de Gaulle's resignation, future presidents shaped the system in their own ways. But the strong executive he designed endured. Leaders such as Georges Pompidou, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, François Mitterrand, and Jacques Chirac oversaw periods of economic growth, social change, and political debate. France also entered a new chapter of European cooperation, becoming a founding member of the institutions that would eventually evolve into the European Union. This shift toward European integration marked a fundamental reorientation of French foreign policy, balancing national independence with shared sovereignty. Throughout these decades, the question of how to remember and interpret the colonial past remained deeply contested. Debates emerged about how schools should teach colonial history, how museums should present artifacts from former colonies, and how public memory should address the violence and injustices of imperial rule. These discussions reflected a broader struggle to come to terms with a complex legacy that included both cultural exchange and coercion, both development and exploitation. In the African context, French influence gradually shifted from direct intervention toward negotiation, diplomacy, and economic partnerships. Some African countries pursued closer ties with France, while others moved away, asserting greater independence. The end of the Cold War and the rise of global economic forces further changed the dynamic as China and other powers increased their presence on the continent. France had to adapt to a world in which it was no longer the dominant external actor. As France moved deeper into the 21st century, it found itself shaped not only by the achievements and challenges of the Fifth Republic, but also by the long shadow of its imperial past. The empire, once spread across continents, had formally ended, yet its legacy continued to influence politics, society, culture, and identity. Modern France became a nation where the memory of empire lived on in public debates, in communities descended from colonial subjects, in diplomatic relationships, and in ongoing questions about justice, identity, and belonging. To understand contemporary France, one must examine how the country remembers, confronts, and reinterprets its imperial history. One of the most visible ways the empire shaped modern France is through its population. Millions of French citizens today trace their origins to Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, or the Pacific, regions that were once under French colonial rule. Immigration from former colonies increased after the Second World War, as France needed labor for reconstruction and industrial growth. Later, decolonization accelerated migration as political change, economic pressures, and historical ties encouraged many to move to the metropole. These communities enriched France with new cultural traditions, languages, cuisines, and perspectives, yet they also faced, and continue to face, questions of identity and belonging. For some, France offered opportunity and stability. For others, structural inequality, discrimination, and social exclusion became persistent challenges. Housing policies, employment disparities, and tensions between police and residents in urban suburbs fueled long-running debates about citizenship and justice. The social geography of modern France often reflected legacies of colonial relationships. Many immigrant families settled in suburban neighborhoods around major cities, areas that evolved into dense, diverse communities, but also into zones of economic marginalization. These suburbs, known as banlieues, became focal points in national conversations about inequality, public investment, and integration. France's model of citizenship, emphasizing universal equality and secular public life, sometimes struggled to accommodate the cultural and religious diversity created by post-colonial migration. The issue of secularism itself, central to French identity, became more complicated in a multicultural society. Some public debates focused on how religious symbols, particularly Islamic ones, should be expressed in public spaces. These discussions often invoked the values of the Republic but were also deeply intertwined with colonial history, especially the legacy of France's long presence in North Africa. The memory of Algeria, in particular, shaped attitudes and policies in subtle and explicit ways. Even decades after independence, Algerian history remained emotionally charged, affecting both French citizens of Algerian descent and those whose families had once lived as settlers in the colony. The state also wrestled with how to teach and remember the empire. For much of the 20th century, French education presented colonialism through a narrative of national mission and modernization. Only gradually did schools begin integrating accounts of violence, exploitation, and resistance. This shift reflected a broader recognition that colonialism had been complex, often contradictory, and deeply consequential. Debates emerged about how textbooks should describe the conquest of Algeria, the wars in Indochina, the slave trade in the Caribbean, and the role of African soldiers in both world wars. Museums and monuments became sites of reflection and controversy. Some institutions expanded exhibits on colonial history, acknowledging both cultural exchange and the brutality of conquest. Others faced criticism for holding artifacts taken during colonial rule without recognizing the circumstances under which they were acquired. Negotiations over returning cultural objects to African countries sparked discussions about historical responsibility and shared heritage. These debates forced France to consider the ethics of preservation and the rights of former colonies to reclaim their cultural treasures. Memory politics reached into public spaces as well. Statues of colonial figures, long-standing symbols of imperial pride, faced scrutiny. Activists questioned whether such monuments should remain in prominent places without contextual explanation. While some argued that removing statues risked erasing history, others insisted that celebrating figures connected to oppression perpetuated injustice. Several cities chose to add plaques explaining historical context, while a few removed controversial monuments altogether. These actions reflected a nation grappling not only with its past, but with the values it wished to project into the future. In the diplomatic sphere, the legacy of empire shaped France's modern foreign policy. Relationships with former colonies evolved into partnerships marked by cooperation, tension, and mutual dependence. Many African countries maintained close ties with France through cultural, economic, and political connections. French remained an official language in several states, and France continued to host students, artists, and professionals from across the Francophone world. These links strengthened France's global cultural presence, known as the Francophonie, an international community centered around shared linguistic and cultural heritage. Yet long-standing controversies also persisted. Some critics argued that France continued to exert excessive influence over African political systems through economic agreements, military presence, and diplomatic pressure. Accusations of neocolonialism surfaced in debates about currency policies, natural resource contracts, and military interventions. France often justified such actions as efforts to maintain regional stability or to counter extremist threats, but this did not always ease local concerns. France's involvement in African security operations during the early 21st century, especially in the Sahel region, highlighted the complexity of these relationships. French troops engaged in missions to support local governments against armed groups. But these interventions sparked both gratitude and resentment. Over time, some African governments sought to distance themselves from French influence, seeking new partnerships with other global powers. These dynamics revealed the changing balance of international diplomacy and the enduring impact of colonial history on present-day politics. Meanwhile, within France, the cultural legacy of empire flourished in new and dynamic forms. Music, film, literature, and fashion drew inspiration from both French and post-colonial traditions. Artists of African, Caribbean, and Asian descent became leading voices in national culture, challenging older narratives and enriching public discourse. Their work explored themes of identity, displacement, memory, and belonging, offering new ways to understand the intertwined histories of France and its former empire. Sports also became a site of shared identity and complex memory. The French national football team, composed of players from diverse backgrounds, became a symbol of modern France. Moments of victory, such as winning global championships, were often celebrated as reflections of national unity. Yet the team also revealed deeper tensions, as public discussions sometimes questioned loyalty, integration, or representation. The team's success demonstrated how post-colonial France could embrace diversity, while debates surrounding it showed the challenges of achieving full inclusion. In law and politics, the nation continued wrestling with the question of historical justice. Efforts to officially recognize the contributions of colonial soldiers in both world wars gained momentum. Some families sought acknowledgement for wartime sacrifices long overlooked by earlier governments. Campaigns for compensation or recognition reflected a broader desire to tell a fuller and more honest story about France's past. Laws were passed acknowledging the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, and new memorials were created to honor the victims of slavery and colonial violence. Generational change contributed to shifting perspectives. Younger citizens, more distant from the imperial era itself, demanded transparency and accountability in historical narratives. They pushed for educational reforms, public acknowledgement of past injustices, and discussions about how history shapes present inequalities. Their activism helped broaden national conversations and ensured that the legacy of empire remained a subject of active inquiry rather than quiet neglect. Modern France, therefore, stands at a crossroads between memory and future. The empire is no longer a political reality, yet its influences are woven into nearly every aspect of contemporary life: demographic, cultural, diplomatic, and political. The challenge for France is not to erase its history, but to understand it fully, confront its contradictions, and build a society that acknowledges both the achievements and the injustices of its past. As France continues to evolve, the memory of empire remains a powerful force, one that inspires pride, provokes controversy, and shapes the stories the nation tells about itself. The history of the French Empire, stretching from the early days of the Franks to the complexities of the modern Fifth Republic, reveals a country transformed again and again by conflict, ambition, innovation, and reflection. Today, the empire exists not as a political structure, but as a legacy, one that continues to influence how France understands its identity, its responsibilities, and its place in a rapidly changing world. This completes the final section of the documentary's journey through the full history of the French Empire.